A really playful reference we can use to establish, for example, kind of almost good spine movement, good kind of healthy spine movement through backswing is actually using, and again, this is something which for some can take several attempts to get very precise at doing, and certainly very kind of aware of doing. So don't really get too stressed if this in the first attempt of doing this. If it needs just a few ways, just to really then, almost a few attempts, sometimes to really connect with this and establish this, is the idea that as you rotate through backswing, that loosely speaking, again, this is not an absolute, actual anatomical response. It's more of a concept, a perception, almost a playful aspiration. So we can be very divisive in some ways. What really happens anatomically is kind of one area we can explore, but then in that very playful, that much more conceptual, perceptual approaches, when I'm trying to move that way, it actually then produces the movements we're trying to achieve. Although, for example, it may not be absolutely accurate what happens. So again, often that gets demonized, but in many ways that is the reality of how people move. This is what we're trying to really produce in that very precise, very kind of accurate, very evidence-based way. But to actually do this, it can actually kind of mean this to me. So the idea of concepts and perceptions can be slightly separate in some ways from the accuracy of movement, as long as they actually produce and achieve then the accuracy of movement we're looking to achieve. So taking kind of finger and thumb here, almost place, if I kind of turn back onto the camera now, either side of the spine on those kind of big paraspinal muscles, those big erector spinae muscles. So into that start position, kind of finger and thumb, and just kind of again, once again, place those kind of fingers and thumbs either side of that spine. If I turn to the back again, on those kind of large kind of paraspinal thick muscles, those kind of large muscles along the side of the spine. As we start to rotate through backswing, in order to ensure that lovely spine movement, that lovely ribcage movement, as we rotate through backswing, be very mindful to address. And this is a very much a somewhat kind of internal question, somewhat rhetorical question in some ways. When I take my start position, what pressure, what activity am I aware of through both thumb and finger to address? And as I rotate and move through backswing, can I then maintain equal pressure and equal activity, equal stimulus in some ways, underneath both thumb and finger? So why is this so valuable? Often what we can see, as now shown with those images on the screen, is this real thickening, this almost enlargement, this overactivity through that kind of trail side of the spine, often because of how we move through backswing and how the spine produces rotation. The response that then creates, the adaptation then creates in downswing, creates this large overactivity, this idea of being hypertonic, too much kind of tonicity in those tissues. We get very overactive, very kind of developed in some ways kind of through that trail side, which then becomes a perpetual kind of issue. The overactivity through the trail side kind of makes me move this way in backswing. I move that way in backswing, I have to then adapt this way in transition, therefore I get very overactive in that trail side. So again, when we got that kind of thumb and finger, when we start to almost, for example, collapse through that lead side or get very overactive, for example, in that lateral flexion, that spine and downswing, we can then start to feel and observe this side is getting more active. I can feel more pressure on the thumb, for example. I can feel more kind of, lack of pressure now under that finger. So once again, thumb and finger, either side of the spine in that kind of low back. As you start to make rotations down and through, just be very mindful that can I get in this very playful sense, not this absolute sense, can I keep equal pressure either side of that finger and thumb? And again, using these examples on the screen now, we can see, for example, through the kind of 3D animation, when we get this excessive kind of lateral flexion and extension through backswing, the GPS, which I call the brain's best navigational system, it then goes, well, how do I get here from here? Then that excessive lateral flexion, often coupled sometimes with often that pelvis thrusting forwards, is then what puts huge loads because of the speed we're moving at and the forces we're both producing and also being exposed to, which we have to absorb then. That concept of whatever forces you produce, we also have to absorb. That force absorption through that kind of that excessive lateral flexion then is what then creates that thickening, that overdevelopment, that almost that enlargement then through that trail side. So a very playful way again, finger and thumb, either side of kind of the spine on those tissues. As we make a rotation back, can I keep equal pressure either side of that finger and thumb as I start to move into down? So once again, loosely speaking, there'd be a slight shift in the needle, so don't be super rigid on this. It doesn't have to be absolutely the same. We're looking at, again, in that very playful way. So again, it's applying context, it's applying that kind of very, using intellect in some ways. Okay, it's not absolutely the same, but to a level, as I move through back and down, so I can keep equal pressure on both sides of the tissues on either side of the spine, can be a wonderful way of establishing good spine movement, good ribcage movement through both back and downswing.